Hello and welcome to the Established Self-Love Summit. I am your host, Tricia Reid. The Established Self-Love Summit is an open dialogue presenting ideas on the exploration and nurturing of self-love and all the ways we could be blocking the love we so inherently crave. I look forward to exploring this further with you. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew Newberg.
So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So what I'm doing is I'm interviewing experts whose research and methods and modalities have helped me and many others in the lifelong journey to reduce the inner critic and reclaim the body and find the real you. So we're just going to take a moment to, not discredit anything else that's brought us here today, but we're all here and we're just going to be in this moment and learn and grow together. And so the whole point is to share information. So this is Andrew Newberg. I chose Andrew because he's so open and curious about the brain and everywhere it could lead us. And so in his own words, he has surrendered to be able to understand the nature of these experiences of enlightenment. And I love those words. That really, I kind of summarized those words, but those were your words in a couple different interviews I listened to. So Andrew Newberg is an MD. He's an American neuroscientist. He's the director of research at the Myrna Bryan Institute for Integrative Medicine at Thomas Jefferson University. You want to tell us a little bit more? That is what you're currently doing.
We are the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health now, and which is
Okay.
But yes, it's been an exciting transition for me. About 10 years ago, I came to Thomas Jefferson University to be part of their Integrative Medicine Center, and it's really been very exciting, mostly in the context of research for me, but we have a full clinical program and an educational program. In fact, one of the things we're very excited about is that in the past, literally in the past few months, we have officially become a department in the university, and so we are the first Department of Integrative Medicine within an academic medical university in the United States and maybe in the world. And so what's exciting about that is that basically, we're sitting at the table with the heads of the Department of, surgery and neurology and radiology and so forth. So we've been able to kind of elevate this perspective, which is a very integrative, very multidimensional perspective of the human person, as a fundamental part of what it means to be a physician, what it means to help to take care of people and to help heal people. And, I'm sure we'll be getting into this kind of thought process, but, we really, what I love about our model of integrative medicine is the idea that we think about people among 4 different dimensions, which is obviously the biological, which is where we come at it from the more medical perspective, but that we are social, psychological, and spiritual beings as well. And that if we are going to do our best job at helping people, that we need to think about people along those different dimensions and to help to take care of people along those dimensions. And so, and again, to me, the model is such that if you need an antibiotic, I'm happy to give you an antibiotic, but if I can do things to help you in terms of your diet and nutrition, in terms of making sure that you have good social support, in terms of your psychological health and well-being, your spiritual paths that you might take. I mean, all of those are part of that process and become an essential part of how we help to heal people. So, and then of course, as the director of research, my job is to also try to not just say, well, let's do these things, but let's try to understand how they work, which things may work more effectively, how do we weave together these different ideas and really find ways of helping people, so that it's not just saying, eat this diet or do this meditation, but why are we doing this meditation? Why are we doing this diet? And how do we think about how it might be helpful, whether it's just to keep somebody healthy, whether it's to help people with specific problems like cancer or heart disease or other types of issues, and to really try to understand that. And of course, one of my main kind of areas is imaging, and so we do a lot of brain imaging and body imaging to help us understand the physiological correlates of these different issues and these different processes.
So where can you guys take that right now? What are you able to show right now? I mean,
well, I think that one of the things which is very exciting to us, we have a very special kind of scanner called a PET MRI scanner that allows us to do what's called PET imaging, positron emission tomography, and MRI imaging. More people probably are familiar with MRI of the brain and the body in people simultaneously. And so whether it's taking a healthy person to see how a certain practice that you might do, a meditation or yoga practice, might help with helping the brain stay strong, whether it is taking people who have different problems, like and whether they're chronic conditions like irritable bowel or chronic fatigue or depression or headache or cancer. How we can look at all the different parts, how we see the body and the mind, body and the brain interacting with each other to really best understand that. And of course, and with the focus on the brain, we can see the areas of our brain that are involved in our cognitive processes, our emotional processes, the experiences that we have of the world. And I've been really lucky to be able to do this kind of research where we're trying to explore, as you mentioned in the introduction, about enlightenment, other types of spiritual experiences, and of course we can get into any and all of that as we go through today. But there's just so much for us to learn and explore, and so it's very exciting. We're just really just scratching the surface, as I like to say, of what of what all of this is about, and so we're hoping that this research and this work has implications on just many different levels, from the very practical, biological, medical level to the very esoteric, what is enlightenment, what is reality kind of level, and everything in between.
So explain to us why you got into this originally. What drew you in?
Well, for me, in many ways, this has been a lifelong kind of quest. I have been asking these questions since I was a kid about some of these real kind of fundamental questions about the nature of who we are as human beings. How do we perceive reality? How do we think about ourself? How do we understand that self? What happens to that self when people have different kinds of experiences, like mystical experiences? And as I went through, I guess I started out saying, well, it must have something to do with what's going on in the brain. It's our brain that's looking at the world and trying to interpret it for us and help us to understand it. But as I kind of went through my training, as I got up into college, I realized that as wonderful as science is and as wonderful as neuroscience is, there are certain interesting limitations that we wind up finding, and that it's important to explore other approaches to these questions. And so I started to get into the study of various philosophical and traditions and religious and spiritual traditions to see what they had to say, and studied Buddhist, Hindu thought, pretty much all the major traditions, and many others as well, and philosophers, what they had to say on it. And so all of this stuff was kind of swirling around in me, and I was just very, very fortunate that when I got into medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, I connected with two mentors who were just fantastic, and one of them was an imaging person, and so he and I started working together on brain imaging and looking at Alzheimer's and schizophrenia and head injury and all that kind of stuff. And then the other one was a psychiatrist who had been also exploring these same basic questions about the nature of reality and religious and spiritual experiences, really dating back to the 1970s. And so when we all met up in the early 1990s, now I can't believe it's about 30 years ago. I didn't think I was that old, but I don't feel it. But
Good. The older I get, the younger I feel. I'm going to be honest.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So at least we keep telling ourselves that. But it was a wonderful synergy, and we started to talk about these questions, and then ultimately that proverbial light bulb kind of went off in my head. I said, well, gee, if we're using brain imaging to study Alzheimer's and depression, why can't we use it to study religion and spirituality? And so, based on the initial work that my colleague and I had been working on, which developed these models about what's going on in the brain during meditation and various spiritual practices, we started to study the brains of people engaged in these practices. And since that time, I guess our first studies were done in about mid 1990s. We've probably studied, 400 or 500 different individuals doing all different kinds of practices, ranging from the monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to Buddhism, Hindu, to other types of practices, and mindfulness, and so forth. and really trying to get a very well-rounded idea as best as possible of what these different practices and experiences are like. And so that's really been kind of my path, and to continue to explore them. All of this information continues to swirl in my own mind to try to figure it out. I like to call it kind of a combined scientific and spiritual pursuit, because I'm not really sure exactly how much each ultimately will contribute to these issues and these questions, but it becomes, I think, essential for us to look at this very multidisciplinary process and try to understand them as best as possible.
So what comes to mind for me as you're saying all this is the scans that you're able to do. Are you able to see what's happening in the rest of the body along with the brain simultaneously?
Yes. So, I mean, now we haven't done that all the time, but that is some of the direction that we're now heading in, which is that we have an ability to look at the brain and the body at the same time. And so when people have depression, for example, or if they have pain somewhere in their body, we can do an image of the body, we can do an image of the brain, and we can see how those things intersect with each other, how much of the experience is something that is kind of manifested primarily in what's going on in the brain versus, how is it felt throughout the body. I mean, clearly they are felt throughout the body. The question is trying to understand what that relationship is, and that has some very important implications in terms of how we understand our overall, both physical and mental health and well-being. So, so I think that the more we do this kind of work, the more we will understand how to integrate these different aspects of the brain and the body. And of course, we use imaging, but there are many other approaches as well. People are doing some fascinating studies looking at what's going on in the immune system, in our hormones, in our autonomic nervous system. So there's just a really important and expanding amount of research into this area, a field that we sometimes refer to as neurotheology. It's the idea of how we can understand that link between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves, and try to understand what that relationship is. What does it mean in terms of the religious and spiritual side of ourselves, as well as the biological side of ourselves, and how can we kind of apply that neurotheology to some very practical questions about health and well-being. So all of this is part of it.
I mean, this is huge. Like this topic is huge. I love this. It means a lot to me personally. So how do you see this playing, and the work you're doing playing out in what society needs right now? Like, do you think there's answers that you're going to be able to offer?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think that there are some really practical applications of this work. We've talked a little bit about some of them, but certainly, practices like meditation, yoga, prayer, people do these for religious and spiritual purposes, but they also can be used as a kind of almost a therapeutic approach. And so whether people turn to a meditation practice to help them improve their cognition, reduce their stress, reduce their anxiety and depression, there's a lot of different things that we can look at that can be very helpful. And obviously it'd be fabulous if we can tell people with depression, for example, hey, you don't need that antidepressant. Let's just have you do a certain form of meditation or a certain type of yoga, and that will help you as much as a good antidepressant will. Now, obviously, again, I mean, there's some people who have, there's different ranges of depression. And so there are certainly people who will absolutely need medications, and sometimes even more aggressive types of therapies. But I think, looking at how these practices might be useful in specific clinical contexts, either by themselves or in conjunction with those medications, can be very, very helpful. So, I think that that's important. I think that this whole idea about understanding human beings as multidimensional beings, and I don't mean that we exist in multi-dimensions, but that, that we have that spiritual side of ourselves. I hope that this research is helpful for that. And I think in many ways, it helps the medical community see that. So when I go and give a talk to psychiatrists, they're very medically based, which is totally fine and very reasonable. But to bring in this whole other perspective and say, let's think about these other pieces of the person that you're taking care of, and maybe you can have them turn to their religious and spiritual traditions, their religious and spiritual practices. Maybe they can adopt new ones if they think that they would be helpful. And how does one do that in an appropriate way without, coming off as if you're trying to make somebody religious or whatever.
So is it well received when you're trying to present this from the science-based research? I mean, obviously, if you're doing the brain scans and you're able to scan
Sure.
the bodies and show them, can they then step back from where the spirituality or religious side of that conversation is?
Well, I'm probably a little naive and certainly a bit optimistic about things, but yeah, I mean, I think in general it's been pretty well received. I mean, and part of it is we do try to be careful. I'm not trying to convince people to be religious. I'm not trying to convince people not to be religious. I'm really just trying to say here's the data. Let's look at what we can know, to sort of present it to people in a way that hopefully they can understand. And that's always one of the things that I love about the whole field of neurotheology for me, because it's a completely different talk if I'm talking to people in a church or a synagogue versus if I'm talking to a group of psychiatrists versus a group of anthropologists. So everybody sort of has a different way of wanting to look at it, and I think it's important to reach out to each individual where they are and say, well, here's the information. This is what we have learned. This is what we have yet to learn, and try to present it in a grounded way, in a way that has a good amount of rigorous science so that scientists can appreciate it from a scientific perspective, but to say, there are these discussions. And so, hopefully that brings scientists a little bit more into the philosophical realm. I love going, I gave a talk last year at a conference in Israel with a lot of theologians, and say, maybe maybe you can look at the science a little bit. And that they don't have to be oppositional with each other, that they really can come together. And so I think that these kinds of things, these kinds of approaches can be very, very helpful. And those are some of the, so they're actually, going back to your initial question about how is this helpful, I think there's some very practical applications. Can we use a certain meditation to help people with depression or, whatever circumstance it may be? I hope it's beneficial in opening science up to the complexities of what humanity is about, and help us to appreciate that. One other side, which we can, expand on a little bit later if you'd like, is to also help people with kind of the negative side of these things. And, obviously in your discussion about sort of how we think about ourselves, we certainly hope, and certainly a lot of spiritual pursuits get people to think about themselves from that more positive, compassionate, loving kind of perspective. But clearly that doesn't happen in a lot of people. And certainly a lot of people have very negative views of themselves, of others, of what they think, God is. And in that context, I think the idea that trying to understand when religious and spiritual ideas, when some of these psychological processes kind of go wrong, how do we understand what happens when those processes go wrong? And can we help people figure out ways of turning them into something, redirecting them into something that would be more positive for them?
Can you explain to us what's happening in the brain when their train of thought is going more negative? And is there a very fast way to just kind of work with that right off?
It's an interesting process. When we talk about kind of the good and the bad of what's happening with regard to people's emotions and their feelings, there are a variety of different things that go on. So, for example, when we have more positive emotions, then the areas of our brain, the emotional centers of our brain, our limbic system, can become more active and can actually help them to be give them a more positive feeling. There may be other aspects that are going on in the brain. For example, one of the neurotransmitters, dopamine, is considered to be part of the reward system, the feel-good system of the brain. And so a release of dopamine in the brain may be part of this process, may be part of what helps people to feel good. And then on the other hand, when people wind up with something more negative, part of what happens is that they're similarly activating these areas of the emotional centers of the brain, but they activate the more negative aspects of it. And so these elicit, we talk about the autonomic nervous system and the fight or flight response. These elicit these kind of fear reactions, negative reactions, very strong negative emotions. And that's what gets our heart rate up and our blood pressure up and things like that. And so there are ways of trying to measure and monitor those. Interestingly, even when we look at the brain and we say, an area of our brain lights up on the MRI scan, we're looking at maybe thousands, if not millions of neurons. So what lights up for a positive emotion in a structure like the amygdala versus what lights up in the amygdala for a negative emotion, you might see the amygdala light up on both circumstances, and in fact we do, but they're obviously
With the same intensity?
Well,
With the same
can
intensity?
be, yeah, it can
Okay.
be, but it could be a different set of 10,000 neurons that are firing away, and but oftentimes, I mean, it can be the same intensity. I mean, normally fear reactions are and negative reactions are stronger in general, and so overall, yes. I mean, I guess I shouldn't have answered it as saying that they are the same, but oftentimes they can be. But usually, negative emotions are a little bit stronger, and that's part of how the brain is supposed to work for us. The brain is supposed to protect us, and so we want to remember things that are very negatively charged, because those are the things that we have to avoid. Those are the things that can ultimately, injure ourselves or cause us harm to our physical body. And so we want to remember, the bad piece of food that we should avoid in the future. We want to, if we go down a dark alleyway and get mugged, we don't go down that dark alleyway again, because it isn't good. And so we remember that. But that also is part of what spills over into some of the more problematic psychiatric problems, like post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety disorders and things like that, because people really can't give up those negative perspectives on things, and sometimes that can be very challenging and very important for us to try to figure out ways of working with.
So when these emotions are happening in the different parts of the brain, whether it's a negative or positive, what is it? Could you explain what is happening in the rest of the body with the bodily fluids and that energy or that emotional effect through the rest of the body? What's happening? Since our focus is reclaiming the body, let's talk about what's happening in the rest of the body.
Right. Well, so I mean, there are a variety of things that happen in the body. Ultimately, the brain is deeply connected with every part of how the body works. We have neurons that connect with other parts of the body. The autonomic nervous system is fundamental to regulating all the body's interactions and reactions. And then there's also hormones and different neurotransmitters that get released into the body itself. So, for example, if you do have a very negative kind of emotional response, then you feel it up in the brain, you perceive it, you experience the emotion. That triggers a very central structure called the hypothalamus to alter the nervous system, and it triggers the arousal system, what's called the sympathetic nervous system, to kick in. And so it releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure. They're attached to virtually every organ of the body. So your digestion, I mean, that's why when you get anxious, you feel, your stomach is churning because it's connected to the stomach. You feel your heart beating because it's connected to your heart. Your respirations go up, your eyes get, wide and dilated. And so, there's a lot of different changes that occur throughout the body as a result of the brain. And in fact, I mean, interestingly, one way of trying to help people who have anxiety, for example, is to give them a beta blocker, which doesn't do anything to the brain itself, but it sort of stops these reactions in the body. And so the body and the brain feed off of each other. In fact, a very well-known neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio wrote a book called A Feeling of What Happens. And in that, he talks about how maybe our emotions come more from our body up rather than from our brain down. And that, when you get anxious or stressed, you feel your heart beating faster, and your heart beating faster tells you I'm stressed. And so if you can do something like give a medication that calms the heart down, then your body says, oh, I'm maybe I am okay, and then it starts to kind of cycle down instead of cycle up. But yeah, so I mean, these are a variety of different things that go on in the body. Cortisol, which is the main stress hormone, is released during stress states, and cortisol has all kinds of effects in the body. And one of them, of course, is a reduction in the function of the immune system. So
there, talk about it. Go there.
Well, I mean, we all take hydrocortisone cream for a rash because it suppresses the immune system locally, and people who have autoimmune disorders like lupus and other types of autoimmune processes will be given steroids or other types of immune modulators to reduce the immune system, but they're given steroids, which are basically, very powerful forms of cortisol. So if you have higher stress, your cortisol levels go up and your immune system goes down. And presumably that means that you are more likely to be infected by, the coronavirus or anything else. And on the other hand, if you are able to do a practice like meditation, there have been some very interesting studies where they took people who were getting a flu vaccine and they had them go through meditation, half of them go through meditation, half of them not. And what they found was that the people who went through meditation had a better physiological reaction to the vaccine. They produced more antibodies because their cortisol levels were ultimately lower. So it all makes sense. I mean, if you can do something that reduces your stress and makes you feel comfortable, then your quiescent, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. Your heart rate slows down, your body slows down, you feel more comfortable, you're able to rest and relax, you can rejuvenate your energy stores, you feel calm. And all of those are the feelings that, go through the body. And then, other neurotransmitters like dopamine, like serotonin that help us to feel calmer, actually start to kick in and help us to feel better. So there's a lot of different things that go on in the body and the brain in both directions, and they have very profound influences on various aspects. Now, it's also perhaps why, large scale studies have looked at things like optimism, for example, or long-term stress, and they find out that those people who are more optimistic tend to have lower rates of heart disease and lower mortality rates, perhaps because their body is working better and it isn't always in this stressed circumstance. And then those people who do have anxiety and depression, they have higher rates of cancer and infections and things like that because their body is not operating as well as it could. And again, though, there's a cycle too. I mean, obviously, people become more anxious when they have a disease, and then the disease makes them more anxious, and then so it can kind of go both ways.
Right. So when it comes to what you're working on now and different methods, are you guys trying to pull together methods based on the research you're doing now so that you can measure them and then say, hey, these could be helpful in, reducing your overall stress or reducing the immediate stress? Or is there anything like that?
And when you say methods, are you talking about measurement methods, or are you talking about the different practices?
I think different practices, but since you guys are running tests and looking at the whole human, what is it you guys are seeing?
Well, certainly, when people come into our integrative medicine center, we do kind of approach them on kind of this multi-dimensional level. And so, if somebody came in and wanted us to try to help them with a health problem or just help optimize their overall health, we do talk to them about their diet and nutrition. We would give them, or we talk to them about some type of mind-body practice, a meditation or yoga program. We would discuss with them the different stressors in their lives and help them to improve the way they respond to stress. We talk to them about their social environment and try to understand, whether their social world is helping them or creating problems for them, and how they might manage that more effectively. Sometimes people need more help psychologically in different psychotherapeutic approaches. And again, whether people need medication or not, it depends. It depends on how, how problematic a given issue is for people. So we definitely do look at people kind of, taking multiple practices, multiple things that we can do for people. Now, the downside of that, certainly from a research perspective, is that if people, if we do all of these things with somebody who's depressed and they feel less depressed, then we don't necessarily know if it was the diet and nutrition that made things better, if it was the meditation that made things better. So a lot of times in our research studies, we wind up having to break it out into these individual elements. But ultimately, we think that it's important to have a very kind of multidisciplinary, multidimensional, comprehensive, and integrative approach to helping people.
I like that. You did bring up something that struck me, and you and I had talked about this previously, is about the community. And let's talk about the community reference, if you wouldn't mind, and how that's affecting the mind, the mental state.
Yeah, well, I mean, we wrote a book a couple of, actually maybe about 10 years ago now, called Why We Believe What We Believe. And And in that, we certainly focus a lot on the brain and how our brain operates. But one of the things that we clearly recognized and found a lot of evidence for is the relationship that we have with others. And so, all of the things that we believe in our lives, not all, but a large, large majority, maybe 95%, pretty much come from other people, or at least come from our interactions with other people. It starts with our parents. Our parents are the ones who basically tell us what's right and wrong, not to, pour your glass upside down, and not to, and to clean up your room, and to be a good student, and to not, hit your sister, and, whatever it is. But they gave us a kind of a moral foundation. And of course, for those parents who have different religious and spiritual traditions, they take their child to synagogue, school, religious school, yoga retreats, whatever it is that they do. And so this is what, as a person's neurons are developing, this is what starts to happen, that, you actually begin to, foster the changes of what's going on in the brain through the process of this social interaction. And then, of course, as we get older, then we start to meet our friends who affect our the ways in which we believe, our teachers, ultimately our spouses and children. So much of the way in which we think about ourselves can be heavily dependent on the social influences that we have. And then, of course, we bring into that what our brain can do. And so, each of our brains has certain proclivities in terms of, do we rely more on our logical side, our spiritual side, our more emotional side, experience? How do we weight those different parts of ourselves? And there's no right, correct way or right or wrong way to do it. It's just that each of us has a brain that kind of looks at things in slightly different ways. And so, so part of what we wind up doing as far as human beings go is to try to say, well, these are the different influences that affect our lives. And of course, everything that we do then affects other people's ideas and beliefs. And so there is this kind of synergy or resonance that can occur. And of course, there's a lot of interesting issues that come up here. I mean, we're heavily influenced by other people. I mean, that's why commercials work, and
Right.
that's why, disinformation works, and all the complaints about news outlets and things like that. Why? Because they work. If everybody, whatever side you're on, if you only hear that perspective, then that keeps reinforcing the neural connections in your brain that supports that perspective. And of course, if you go to listen to, you turn the channel to a news outlet that doesn't share your own perspectives, then your brain has a lot of trouble with it. And all of us do. I mean, it's not like one side is right and the other side is wrong. What the data really show is that, all of our brains are making all kinds of mistakes all the time. We rely on a very small amount of information to try to put together a completely comprehensive perspective of the world around us. And then, we take pieces of information and that seem to make sense to us and support our views. Anything that contradicts those views, we tend to reject. And there's a good reason to reject them. Our brain, like, I mentioned this earlier. I mean, our brain is designed to keep us alive and help us to survive. And one of the best ways it does that is to give us a perspective of the world that works for us. So if we go through the world, and I'm just going to take a random example, but if we go through the world as a conservative Christian, for example, then as soon as you get to any kind of information that goes against that, your brain has a decision to make. Either, this new piece of information or this other person is right and you're wrong, or, you're right and they're wrong. Well, the brain is not going to be too happy to think that we're wrong, because that means that puts us in a very vulnerable situation. So it is far easier for us to reject what other people tell us and what other people say. And again, this is, not restricted to religions. I'm a long-standing scientist, and, scientists are human beings like everybody else and are just as guilty, if not more so, of rejecting things, just because they don't sound right, they don't feel right. Where's the data? They'll reject data that doesn't support their ideas, and they'll accept the same lousy data that supports their ideas. So we're all in this very interesting problem of trying to make sense of a world that is basically infinite, and we have a very limited mind, looking out at that world, trying to make sense of it. And so, that's what I have learned from all of this, which is that we have to be pretty open and understanding and compassionate of what everybody believes, because we're basically all in the same boat. We're all just looking out on a universe that we're trying desperately to make some sense out of, and hopefully, whatever we come to, works well for us and helps us get through our lives. We try to, in our own work, we try to encourage people to engage other ideas and other beliefs as a way of helping the brain to kind of look at reality more thoroughly. But it's hard for everyone to do, myself included. And so, these are the challenges that we all face, and we try to understand them and help people
Right.
to appreciate them and learn from them.
We're meaning-making creatures, is what I like to say.
Yep.
So you've written a number of books. How many books altogether have you written?
I think we're up to 10.
Okay, I counted. I think I counted 10 of them. Okay, and then you have TED Talks that you've done, and a few other amazing interviews you've done. What you seem to keep focusing on this, the brain and spirituality, and I would love for you to talk more about that. That seems like that's your big passion. Would you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, a lot of it comes down to, that fundamental question I mentioned earlier about, how do we understand reality? And that's been kind of the main driving question since I was a kid. And part of what I guess I came to recognize in my own thought processes was a sort of, a deep philosophical, contemplative process, really, thinking about these things and trying to understand them. And so, part of what kind of has happened for me personally is as I go through this contemplative process, uh, looking at different experiences that are often described as spiritual experiences or mystical experiences, and what they mean to people and how they affect what a person thinks about in the context of reality. And the interesting issue, I guess, that I have come to notice or realize is that when people have these intense spiritual experiences or even mystical experiences, what they do is that they look back, so to speak, on our everyday reality and recognize this reality as not being quite as real. Now, all of us have had this experience. We can all relate to this in a different kind of way, which is that when we're asleep and dreaming, no matter how vivid a dream we may have, when we wake up, we say, "Oh, that was just a dream." So, whether it was this great dream or scary dream, whenever we wake up, we recognize that as a kind of, quote unquote, inferior form of reality. It's not the real reality. This is our everyday experience is the real reality. But what's fascinating to me is that when people have mystical experiences and intense spiritual experiences, they say the same thing, but now with respect to this reality. So this reality suddenly is more like the dream reality. And it's not to say that this is inherently a dream per se, but that there is a more fundamental way of understanding the reality that's around us. And so looking at these mystical experiences to me seems absolutely essential for answering that question about what is the true nature of reality. Because if they're saying they have an experience which trumps this reality, whereas this reality is greater than another, where do we finally end up, and how do we think about our everyday reality? How do we think about a mystical experience of reality? And can we kind of accommodate them? Can we understand them? How are they related to each other? And ultimately, how are they related to each other within the framework of what's going on in our brain when those experiences happen? Is a mystical experience purely the manifestation of the brain's function, seeing the universe in a completely different way? Do we connect to some, more fundamental reality or consciousness that pervades the universe? That's certainly what a lot of people talk about. So the question is, how do we understand that? And so for me, a lot of what I think this is about is trying to look at what religious and spiritual attitudes and experiences do for people in that context of understanding reality. And somewhere within that is thinking about what's going on in the brain, what's going on with those experiences. And in fact, a lot of my more recent research has actually focused on the qualitative nature, the subjective nature of those experiences. What do people actually perceive and think about and feel about? And so in our last book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, we talk about that. We talk about the Enlightenment experiences and the core elements that seem to be part of that, and then thinking about how that relates back to what's going on in the brain.
So do you see far-reaching effects? Because I'm under the impression our perception of reality is our own reality. So the far-reaching effects for these people going through their own amazing experience, that becomes so ingrained in their reality. That's what I perceive as happening? Is that?
Yeah,
is
very
that what
much
you guys
so.
are
I mean,
finding?
and that's, you know, again, it's a fascinating issue on both a scientific as well as a spiritual perspective, which is that when people have these enlightenment kinds of experiences, what we refer to as the big E experiences, you know, a lot of people have the little E experiences, which are those little aha moments that help us to resolve some problem, but the big E ones that, you know, truly radically change everything that a person thinks about the world. You know, one of the things that we have noticed is that you know, there are several characteristics which are really fascinating. One is that it is, as we were saying a moment ago, perceived to be more real than our everyday reality experience. And even when they are no longer having that experience, they perceive it as if it carries a greater fundamental weight with regard to reality than everyday reality. So that in and of itself is just life-changing. And then actually in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, we talk about the data that we got from a large survey of about 2,000 experiences that people reported. And when we asked them questions about how did this change your health and well-being and things like that, you know, the impact that these experiences have, you know, 80–90% of people who have these experiences have changes more intent, you know, for the better, typically.
So it's helping their resilience.
It helps the resilience,
Absolutely.
a sense of meaning and purpose in life.
Yeah.
They no longer fear death. Their relationships are better. Their job and how they handle their job is better. Their spiritual and religious lives are better. I mean, it is quite remarkable how it changes virtually every aspect of who they are. And of course, you know, from the brain perspective, then there's another interesting question with all of this, which is, well, how exactly does that happen? You know, when we think about how our brain changes over time, you know, you learn mathematics slowly. You know, you in kindergarten you learn 1 + 1 = 2, and then by 3rd grade you're doing division, and then by 6th grade you're, you know, doing algebra, and then by 12th grade you're doing calculus. You know, you build up slowly. But here, in what can literally be, you know, seconds, somehow it completely changes a person's life. And so the question always becomes is, you know, well, were all of these different ways of thinking already in your brain that you now have kind of unlocked, you know, like all the games now, if you know, you hit 20,000 points, you unlock a new character or something like that, or a new, you know, new area of reality.
I do think that's part of it, though. I really do.
Yeah.
Because to understand the humanness of what we're all going through, to understand that you guys have, as scientists, said, guess what? There's certain things that are happening in your body. There's certain things that are happening in your brain when. And so the reason why this resonates with me and having this conversation so important is because there's certain ways that science can show us you're just being a normal human. But let me tell you why. And maybe, I mean, for me, it's brought me more comfort and peace, just going, oh, that's what I'm experiencing. I'm totally normal. And I'm more gentle and I'm more resilient. And that inner critic has gotten quieter because of understanding these teachings. So I love the work you're doing, but you were going to go ahead with something else and I totally interrupted. So
well,
no, keep going.
I mean, you raise a really, well, I mean, part of what I was going to say is, you know, were these always within our brain, or is this something that, you know, suddenly rewired our brain? And obviously we don't fully know, but clearly, you know, I think your point is extremely well taken, both, you know, in terms of how we understand things from a philosophical perspective, but also biological perspective, that, you know, what we have learned from our study of these religious and spiritual experiences is that they can be a very normal part of people's lives, or I don't know if normal is the right word, but it can be a very common part of people's lives. And certainly, what I like to say is that not only is it possible that anyone is capable of having one, but everyone is capable of having one. And so when we talk about normal, I agree with you. We people really do need to be much more open and understanding, not only of others but of themselves as well. That again, if you really think about what your brain is able to do, I mean, if the universe is infinite, which it basically is, even if it's not infinite, it's really, really big. And you think about what you have access to. For people who are listening to this right now, you have access to what is in your room, and what's going on in the house next door to you, in the town next door to you, the city next door to you, the country next door to you, the planet next. I mean, you have access to like 0.0000001, and 1,000 zeros, 1%. And then somehow your body says, all right, let's get up in the morning and let's, I got to go to work and live my life. And it's like, it's remarkable that we can even get up in the morning, given how little we really have to work on. So when we make mistakes, when we don't understand things, it's so incredibly understandable that we would have these problems. And in our book, Why We Believe What We Believe, part of what we also took people through in the writing was to show how our brain can make errors, be fooled, miss the mark in so many ways. And that's true of everybody's brain. It doesn't, whether you're a genius or not, your brain makes all kinds of mistakes. One of the things I always like to say is that your brain never notifies you when it has made a mistake. So you just keep going, even though you may now have I mean, how many times have people gotten into an argument with somebody because they thought they said something, and only to realize that, an hour and a half later that no, that's not what they said. And yet, again, I mean, we all have this, our brain is really just doing the best job that it can to make meaning, to make sense of the world. It has a really difficult time doing it, and yet is remarkable in how well it can do it. But I think it really should teach all of us a huge sense of understanding and compassion, for not only for everybody, but for ourselves as well, because we are extraordinarily flawed and fallible, and yet we, if we are kind of, one of the things I talk about in neurotheology is a passion for inquiry, and what I really mean by that is, as long as we keep challenging ourselves, as long as we keep trying to ask questions, we may not always come up with the right answers, we may not always come up with good answers, but if we keep working on it, over time, hopefully we will get closer and closer to something that will be better for us. But it is challenging, and when people, and it's so easy to go down paths that that lead to very negative ways of thinking, and again, I mean, people shouldn't be while people should be, trying to work towards a different way of thinking about it at that point, they shouldn't be surprised that it happens, because it does happen, and the brain is kind of set up for that. It's very hard, and the brain is in a very delicate balance, and pushing that brain a little bit out of balance one way or another, it doesn't take much to knock the brain out of balance, and so, but the good news is that hopefully it doesn't take too much to bring it back in sometimes either, but it's always, it can be a challenge no matter what.
So if you could share a book or a site or anything right now to just we have this captive audience, where would you want to funnel them, knowing everything that's going on right now in our world,
Well, certainly anybody who's interested in looking at my work could go to my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And on there, it has information about the different books. And again, each of them could have different meaning for different people. So if somebody doesn't really care about enlightenment, but they want to learn more about religion, there's books about that. If somebody's more interested in enlightenment, absolutely. We did a book called Words Can Change Your Brain, which addresses a lot of the questions that we talked about here.
I love that one. I love that.
Yeah, how both negative and positive words, and a lot of practical ideas about that as well. But really teaching us about how our brain operates that has a lot to do with how we communicate both with others as well as within our own mind about ourselves. And the idea of why positive ideas and positive thinking and positive language about ourselves is just so fundamentally important in helping us to stay healthy. So, but yeah, the website has that. It has a lot of the research articles. So if people want to delve into the more of the science of it, then there's a lot of different things depending on what people are interested in.
And what about in supporting the work you're doing? Any way to support with funding the work that you guys are doing right now?
You mean if people wanted to provide a source of funding? Well, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. I don't
well,
know.
through my website, you can always get a hold of me. There's a way to link to me, and we are always looking for another funding source, and we're always looking for new projects that are exciting and interesting. Yeah, I mean, a lot of our projects have been funded by either individuals or groups that had particular areas that they were interested in, whether it was a certain type of meditation or a certain type of program, or various questions that were of importance and interest to them. So I mean, that would be wonderful. And there's as we said earlier, I mean, we're just scratching the surface, and the sky is the limit in terms of what we have an opportunity to look at and learn about. And hopefully we all can work on these things together.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome. I really appreciate
you.
your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
All right.